Princess Margaret, a woman caught in the shadow of her sister, who became the ultimate royal rebel.
You just knew if Margaret was there, it was going to be fun.
She wasn't a kind of two-dimensional figure that sort of fit the traditional mould of what a good royal should be.
Margaret could be a total cow, but she could also charm people back from the dead.
Always battling to find a role and personal happiness, she was denied the love she wanted.
She was in love with a man who was a divorcee.
And she had an affair with a man who was 17 years younger than her.
The Queen agreed that the best course of action for her sister was to get divorced.
She was a princess who chose to live her life exactly how she wanted, courting controversy and scandal along the way.
The Queen was furious. She thought her sister was behaving appallingly. It was inappropriate on every level.
She had tarnished the reputation of the royal family. She had damaged the royal family.
Tonight we hear the true story from those who knew her best. Princess Margaret, the rebel without a crown.
Throughout her life, she was going to be doing things her way. She was a star.
In February 2002, the world said goodbye to one of the most intriguing and original princesses the royal family had ever known.
She loved life and lived it to the full. So many people remember her for that vitality and attractiveness. She had this wonderfully sharp mind. One of the fondest memories I shall have of her was always of sitting at the piano, playing away with a large and very elegant cigarette holder in her mouth.
But not all the tributes were quite so complimentary.
When Princess Margaret died, I think the obituaries were stuck to some extent because she was a very complex, contradictory kind of character. She did a lot of work for charity, but she also seemed to be unpleasant on many occasions, came across as entitled, a bit of a snob. In a paradoxical kind of way, she was both a very good person, but she had this terrible reputation for being promiscuous, for getting divorced, the first royal for centuries to get divorced.
Biographer Christopher Warwick was the only author the princess ever cooperated with.
Most people who knew Princess Margaret would agree with the Queen, who always regarded her sister as an enigma. She had the kind of personality that in many ways wasn't so very easy to define. She was a one-off.
But why was she so controversial? Margaret was born into a family who had not even been destined to one day wear the crown. In 1930, the Duke of York, the second in line to the throne, welcomed Margaret into the world. She was a younger sister for their 4-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth.
There's some lovely archive footage of Elizabeth and Margaret when they were growing up. It really speaks to the close relationship they shared, and you can understand why. They didn't go to regular schools. They were each other's best friend. They could go at it. Marion Crawford, their governess, had said they didn't hesitate to argue and fight, and Elizabeth apparently had a good left hook, whereas Margaret wasn't shy to bite her sister in return. So there were the ups and downs that you would imagine from siblings as well. But really, at the end of the day, they had each other's backs.
The youngest is always spoilt, and there's no question that Margaret wasn't spoilt by her mum and dad.
Interestingly, Elizabeth was quite happy for Margaret to be the centre of attention because she said, if Margaret's there, she makes everybody laugh. And so it took the pressure off Elizabeth, who perhaps was slightly more introverted than her mischievous younger sister.
Despite her mischievous ways, there was one family member who was very much in her corner.
She was her father's favourite. He once said, "Elizabeth is my pride, but Margaret is my joy." And certainly he was really the most important man in her life, always. It was her father who was completely central to her.
He had a temper that could flare up without any warning. They called it his gnashes. And Princess Margaret was somebody who could dispel those gnashes by saying something, doing something, even throwing a spoon over her shoulder, and that would dispel the temper, and he would just dissolve into laughter.
But the cosy, family-orientated world of the Duke and Duchess of York was turned on its head in 1936 when Edward VIII abdicated, leaving his brother to step into his shoes.
Before the abdication, Margaret was the younger daughter of the Duke of York, which was quite a long way from the succession. But after the abdication, Margaret's father became King George VI. Her elder sister, Elizabeth, was, of course, the heir to the throne. So Margaret was now relegated to that really difficult position, which is being the younger sibling of the heir to the throne.
I think they were actually known as P1 and P2. It was kind of shorthand, wasn't it, for the two princesses?
Elizabeth suddenly had been set up for a starring role that perhaps she'd never imagined. And Margaret, from then on, had a sense that, not that she was second best, but that she wasn't going to be queen. She had to compensate for not being her sister. And the only way she could do that was by trying to get as much attention as she could by being funnier, louder, slightly more mischievous.
Princess Margaret said to me that she never minded being described or being called the younger daughter. But she said, I always minded being described as the younger sister. And I think part of that was that she minded the idea that she was always in her sister's shadow.
With fewer responsibilities than Elizabeth, Margaret's approach to royal engagements was at times more playful.
Before I finish, I'm going to ask your headmistress if the school may have an extra day's holiday as a mark of my visit.
It's perfectly true that throughout her life, she was going to be doing things her way. But somebody once said to me, I tell you what she was. She was a star.
She was gorgeous. I mean, she had a wonderful figure, a very, very pretty face. She was petite and often charming, not always charming, but the press adored her. She made great copy, great headlines, great pictures. And of course she was out on the town more and more, so she was there to be seen. It's almost the beginning of the paparazzi era, I suppose, and she was mobbed by cameramen increasingly as she grew older and actually more beautiful.
Cameramen of the Italian press were so intent on getting pictures of the princess that she often found it difficult to see anything but them.
Everything she did made news. And during the 50s, the press wanted photographs of only two women. One was Elizabeth Taylor and the other was Princess Margaret.
She was beginning to outshine her sister Elizabeth.
Suddenly, she was the centre of people's attention rather than Elizabeth, who was also very beautiful, but didn't have to make any effort because it was all fixed for her. It was Margaret who had to make the effort.
Even though Margaret struggled to find a clear role, she made sure that she was treated as a member of the royal family.
Margaret had that aura of royalty that you really can't teach, and she quite liked that she was superior in her view. She liked to wear her superiority, and so sometimes that came across in sort of snobbish, but at the time royal deference was a thing, and Margaret milked it for all it was worth.
She enjoyed life. She felt that her sister was going to be queen. There was no major responsibility on her, and therefore she didn't have to toe the line in the same way as her elder sister had to. So she did enjoy clubs, she did enjoy the company of men, she did enjoy parties.
With fewer responsibilities than her sister, Margaret took full advantage of London's nightlife.
She loved going off to various nightclubs. Very often the sun would be rising through the back window of the car as she drove home. And so she'd stay in bed till 11 o'clock.
The princess was enjoying the post-war years, but the health of her father began to cast a shadow over the royal family.
The king was extremely ill. He was a heavy smoker. He had cancer, and he'd had an operation, and he never really fully recovered from that cancer operation. I remember him opening the Festival of Britain in 1951. He certainly did not look a well man. The pressure really was on Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret to kind of stand in for him.
In 1952, Princess Elizabeth flew off on a tour of the Commonwealth. Margaret, however, remained with her father in Britain and stayed with him at Sandringham. 7 days later, her world would be turned upside down.
The man that she absolutely adored had gone to bed that night, kissed them good night, and he'd gone off to bed. They'd had a wonderful evening. They'd had a lovely day. Not a care in the world. And at some time on that morning of the 6th of February 1952, his heart stopped. And it was his page, of course, that went in to wake him and found him dead.
Margaret was devastated by the loss of her father.
She was inconsolable, to the point that she was heavily sedated with sleeping tablets because she couldn't sleep. She was very weepy. I suppose she felt at the time that what future was there for her? What was she going to do? You know, Dad was always there, Papa was always there, and now life was changing dramatically.
One reign has ended, a reign begins.
Princess Elizabeth now became the new monarch. Britain had gained a queen, but Margaret had lost her childhood friend.
As the Queen herself had said, for her, yes, she too was devastated. But she suddenly was Queen. She had a role. She had a husband. She had 2 young children. But as she acknowledged, Margaret was on her own. She'd suddenly lost the man that she adored. What was she going to do? She just was so lost.
Elizabeth was now taken up with the business of being queen and had less time for her younger sister. And with their father now gone, there was no one to rein in Margaret's rebellious tendencies. After her father's death, Margaret's life completely changed. She was no longer the king's daughter, but the Queen's sister. Margaret had to move out of Buckingham Palace. Without her father's guidance, what would the rebellious young princess do next?
She moved into Clarence House with her mother, and that was not always an easy relationship. It wasn't that they didn't love each other, but her mother was never her #1 supporter and was often very critical of what she wore. And Margaret often was humiliating and rude to her mother as well.
Sometimes she would come in and find the Queen Mother watching the racing. The Queen Mother loved racing and, of course, had some horses. And she didn't like that or thought it was boring. She would just simply pick up the remote and change channels. So there was a good deal of irritability, but of course, she did love her deeply, but was difficult with her.
In those days when well-brought-up young girls didn't have a job, for Margaret, who was cleverer than most and smarter, there must have been quite a lot of boredom.
She didn't really know what to do with herself. If everything is done for you, you get up after breakfast, what do you do till lunchtime? That's why she always focused on the evening, because that's when her friends stopped working and came to see her. Sometimes she could be very difficult with the household staff. In Clarence House, the staff, I think she thought of them as her mother's staff, not hers. Not that that's an excuse.
A few years ago, I wrote a book about a chap called Backstairs Billy, who worked for the royal family in Clarence House for more than half a century. He knew Margaret really well, and he told me she could be a total cow, but she could also charm people back from the dead. That was his phrase.
Margaret was also harbouring a secret. She was romantically involved with a man 15 years her senior, Group Captain Peter Townsend. He was a divorcee at a time when the Church of England did not approve of divorce. Despite his record as a war hero, within royal circles he was not seen as a suitable match.
Peter Townsend was an RAF pilot. and after the war he became an equerry to King George VI, which is where he would have come into contact with both princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret. And Margaret, being a sort of teenager, had a crush, and obviously they got fairly close.
You don't need to be a genius to see that what she was lacking in her life was a father figure. And Peter Townsend really encapsulated everything. He provided the rock that she had lost from her father.
Their romance was only known to a few until the day of the Queen's coronation. Away from the cameras, Margaret gave herself and Peter away with a gesture that some beady-eyed journalists picked up on.
In her excitement, Princess Margaret went up to Townsend and put her hand on his tunic to brush away a piece of thread.
This gesture, this very intimate gesture of, a very unroyal way to behave, brushing a man's coat with your hand, is immediately taken up by the world's press. It's the beginning of a whole scandal around Princess Margaret.
Princess Margaret was a very calculating and instinctive sense of drama and an instinctive sense of how to get the attention that she'd craved since she was a girl. The incident with the brushing the fluff from Townsend's jacket, she would have known at such a public event that it would be spotted. And it's the kind of intimate action that speaks volumes.
The coronation of all days is a day which belongs to Margaret's sister Elizabeth. I mean, as Queen, this is perhaps the most important ceremony in her reign. And yet here we have Margaret, her younger sister, doing something out of order, creating a sensation, diverting attention from her sister.
The affair was now public. Margaret's romance with Townsend caused a sensation, particularly as Peter was a divorcee with 2 sons.
She actually had the public's support. I think she was so popular with members of the public, and things were changing. I don't think the public was too concerned that Peter was a divorced father of 2 children. They just saw that she was happy. That was members of the public. If we cut to the government, they were horrified. Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the Queen that the Dominion Prime Ministers would never accept such a marriage. The British Cabinet, Parliament said they wouldn't recognise the marriage.
Townsend's divorce status created a huge problem if there was to be a future with Princess Margaret.
Princess Margaret went to the Queen and said that she and Peter Townsend were in love and that they wanted to marry. It created problems because here you've got the Queen as governor of the Church of England, and it was a church that did not recognise divorce. It also put the Queen as sovereign in a difficult position because at that time, all members of the royal family had to have the Queen's consent in order to marry. The Queen really couldn't give her consent, but by asking them to wait, this was pushing Margaret towards her 25th birthday. Now that was significant because at 25, a member of the royal family no longer needed the sovereign's permission to marry.
As the Queen's younger sister, Margaret was still powerless to make her own decisions. Peter Townsend was sent away from the royal household to become military air attaché in Brussels. Margaret had lost her father, and now she was losing her lover. She wouldn't see him for the next 2 years. But as Margaret approached her 25th birthday, she could now decide for herself if she was going to become the next Mrs. Peter Townsend.
She writes a letter to the then Prime Minister Anthony Eden. She writes very tellingly, and we get very much the sense of doubt. They hadn't seen one another for 2 years. And she said, "It is only by seeing him that I can decide whether I can marry him or not."
On Townsend's return, the press speculated whether Margaret would accept his proposal.
Margaret's status as a celebrity royal really begins at the time of the Townsend romance. There's such an incredible narrative. Here she is, this beautiful princess, and this is the love of her life, and she's being denied this man because of the pressures of the establishment. And the result is that she becomes hugely popular. Margaret sees the press, perhaps mistakenly, as being on her side, and she's not yet aware of the danger that they could turn and destroy you just as quickly as they make you.
Despite the government's initial opposition, behind closed doors they had agreed that Margaret could retain her royal status and her income from the civil list if she decided to marry Peter Townsend. It was now down to Margaret if she was going to accept.
Princess Margaret's personal message issued from Clarence House began with these words: "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend." The announcement followed many months of speculation in newspapers and among the people of Great Britain, indeed throughout the world.
What had happened here was that this huge romance, likened by some romantic journalist to the greatest love affair since Romeo and Juliet, their feelings quite obviously had started to wane, that they were not as much in love as they were.
She cited her commitment to the Christian faith as the reason why she could not accept Townsend's proposal.
That, in its own way, I think, was to save face. Because back in 1955, after 2 years, the press were all over it, they could hardly have just said, "Sorry guys, it's kind of over."
The Queen's sister had rebelled against what was expected of her and turned Townsend down. But in doing so, Margaret's future now looked even more uncertain.
After Margaret broke up with Peter Townsend, her life really enters a bit of a vacuum. She doesn't really have a sense of direction. She has terrible tantrums, she gets very cross, she shuts herself up in her bedroom. She's quite difficult. I think the real problem, and this is not Margaret's fault, what is a princess to do? There's no script.
She was at a crossroads in terms of her private life. She was now in her mid-20s. Was she going to get married? Who was she going to get married to? There were all sorts of young men who were considered eligible bachelors. And it wasn't until sort of late in 1950 that she met a young photographer called Anthony Armstrong Jones. She saw in him something that she would quite like to have been, bohemian, footloose and fancy-free.
Margaret's meeting with Tony would change the course of British royal history. In June 2006, 4 years after Princess Margaret had died, the auction house Christie's sold her possessions for the sum of nearly £14 million. The items on sale gave a unique insight into her personality and tastes.
Some of her clothes were extravagant and extraordinary, but particularly her jewellery. And many of the objects for sale in the auction also reflected her artistic tastes.
The items sold were testament to Margaret's lifelong love of art and artists. Since her early 20s, more than any other member of the royal family, she had been an enthusiastic supporter of the creative arts in Britain.
Margaret has an artistic side to her. Margaret liked actors, directors, ballet dancers, theatre people.
As the 1950s drew to a close, Britain experienced a revolution in fashion, music and art.
We're greatly looking forward to seeing the fashion show, presented by well-known and important designers from Britain.
For Margaret, always the rebel princess, this new world held an irresistible allure.
This is just something that she thought she could make her own. She liked dancing, she liked jazz, she liked staying up late, and she liked to rebel.
So she wanted to spend time with creatives, bohemians.
Since she split from Peter Townsend in 1955, there had been great public interest in Margaret's love life. As she moved farther and farther into Britain's new fashionable art scene, the nation speculated over her relationship status.
By this stage, she'd been introduced to all sorts of potential suitors, and none of them had taken her fancy. I think Margaret always wanted someone who was a bit edgy, a bit dangerous.
In 1958, at the request of one of her male admirers, Margaret was photographed by one of the most cutting-edge photographers in London, Tony Armstrong-Jones.
Tony had a habit of telling his sitters what he wanted them to wear or not wear. He got the princess to change her dress, to alter her jewellery.
For Margaret, who was accustomed to total deference, no one ever told her what to do. This was completely new, and I think that's what made him so interesting and challenging and unique.
That's when they realised they were both incredibly attracted to one another. I mean, he was immensely sexy, and so was she. And it was an attraction, a physical attraction, that they never really lost.
Before long, unknown to both the public and the princess's inner circle, Margaret and Tony started a clandestine relationship.
The two would go to parties, they would arrive separately, and because everyone was so focused on Margaret making a grand marriage, they were able to fly under the radar.
Tony lived in Rotherhithe, East London, far away from the gates and guards of Buckingham Palace.
And he used to take Margaret there on the back of his motorbike, and she absolutely loved it. No one recognised her, of course. Who'd expect a princess to be zooming through the streets of London on the back of a bike with a handsome photographer? And there, you know, they'd make love and they'd smoke a huge amount of cigarettes and drink a huge amount of alcohol and have a lifestyle that she never dreamt she could be part of, I don't think.
In February 1960, the palace announced Margaret's engagement to Tony.
It was a huge, huge shock to everybody. Nobody had even guessed it, even his best friends.
In keeping with her defiance of convention, Margaret's choice of husband seemed unlike any other royal spouse.
Some people were thrilled for them, others were horrified. How could the late king's daughter marry a photographer? How could she marry someone who worked for a living? I mean, this was unheard of.
Tony was the first person without a title, otherwise known as a commoner, to marry into the royals for 400 years. Yet in spite of his outsider status and his rebellious personality, Tony had in fact come from a well-heeled background. His official biographer, Anne de Courcy, interviewed Tony extensively about his life with Margaret.
His father was a QC. He went to Eton. He had a very good education. So I would say his social standing was excellent.
He was around the aristocracy. He knew how to mingle with those types, but he also loved to be around the dancers and models and actresses as well. So he was able to have a foot in both camps.
Yet Tony's social confidence hid the traumas of a tough childhood.
He suffered as a child from polio, and I think that was one of the defining factors of his life. It enables you to take more risks. You might as well live to the full. He was always prepared to indulge every excitement and every risk.
Although Margaret's rebellious nature inclined her towards Tony's artistic set, he would go on to introduce her to a social circle quite unlike anything any royal had ever seen.
Tony's world was completely different from the usual royal world. Bohemian hardly sums it up. He was absolutely at the cutting edge of everything that happened in the 60s. I remember one of his secretaries telling me that the moment tight jeans came in, she had to sit there stitching Tony's jeans as tight as she could. In fact, she had to do them so tight she then had to undo them because he couldn't get them on over his heel.
Tony's relationships before Margaret in particular defied the norms of conventional society.
Tony was a man with a huge sex drive. I mean, a libido like no one else's, I think. One woman would never have been enough.
He told me, I think the way he used to put it was, I love a change.
Tony's colourful love life even drew in best friend Jeremy Fry and his wife Camilla.
I think, you see, Jeremy Fry's wife had been a girlfriend of Tony's. And he loved them both. And he used to go and stay there a lot. And I suppose the best way I can put it was that it was a bit of a free-for-all. I think Tony was bisexual. Somebody once said to me, if it's got socks on, he'll jump on it.
The rebellious Princess Margaret was marrying sexually liberated Tony in the hope he would give up his free-living ways. It was a gamble no other royal had made in their choice of partner. With the wedding day set for May 6, 1960, plans took shape. But there was soon a scandal over Tony's choice of best man, his old friend from Eton, Jeremy Fry.
Jeremy Fry had been embroiled in a homosexual act in 1952 and been fined. Homosexuality was frowned upon. It was also against the law.
And so no longer could he be best man, and so they had to find someone else.
The wedding took place in Westminster Abbey with 2,000 guests. But as the first royal wedding to be televised, another 300 million around the world were able to watch the ceremony.
It seemed quite modern in that we were able to witness it for ourselves. It was no longer something going on behind closed doors.
Brides all over Britain watched every single bit of it, and here she was looking utterly beautiful.
For many commentators, Tony's status as a commoner embodied the sweeping social changes happening across Britain at this time.
In many ways, Margaret's marriage was a great leveller. It showed people that, yes, a member of the royal family can marry a regular person just like you or me.
Margaret and Tony's guest list also ran against the grain of royal tradition.
She filled out the pews with politicians, with celebrities, with the bohemian artistic set that she and Tony had become such good friends with. There were a huge number of celebrities.
Through her wedding, Margaret had rebelled against royal traditions and edged the monarchy closer to the progressive outlook of 1960s Britain. Her choice of honeymoon, too, was a new departure for a royal bride. Margaret and Tony embarked on the Royal Yacht Britannia for a 6-week tour of the Caribbean.
And one of the islands that she decided to visit was the very barren and basic island of Mustique.
Mustique was owned by Margaret's friends, Lord Colin Glenconner and his wife, Lady Anne Glenconner.
Colin said to Margaret when they were on Mustique, "What shall I give you for a wedding present? Would you like a jewel in a box, or would you like a piece of land?" And quick as a flash, Margaret said she'd really rather like a piece of land. And then when he gave her a piece of land on Mustique, she actually asked for it to be a bit bigger.
Having received part of Mustique as a wedding gift, Margaret returned to Britain with Tony. Now known as the Earl and Countess of Snowdon, they settled into life as a royal couple.
For the first years of their marriage, life was wonderful. They were in love, they were happy.
They rode around in a sort of blue roadster, which were so luxurious at the time.
Before long, the rebel royal had become one half of the most famous couple in the country.
I think it was the beginning of royalty being celebrity, being part of the celebrity circuit.
They are really in this very, very glamorous crowd of actors, comedians, writers, artists, you know, the hipsters of the day, the bohemians of the day. You know, it's very cool.
Although now one half of a celebrity power couple, Margaret's own fame had always overshadowed Tony's.
She was extraordinarily beautiful. She had a lovely figure. I don't think it was possible to catch her at a bad angle. She was a completely gorgeous, glamorous sex symbol.
Margaret was breaking new ground as the first royal celebrity of the modern age. But her contrary nature brought her into conflict with others in this exclusive social set.
Sometimes she was so rude, it was staggering. She would say exactly what she thought. She was sitting once next to Twiggy, the model Twiggy, and she ignored her for about 2 hours, and then turned to her and said, "Oh, who are you?" And she said, "Oh, my name's Leslie, ma'am, but most people know me as Twiggy." And she turned and said, "Oh, how unfortunate."
Well, the notice has just gone up at 10 minutes to 12.
In 1961, Tony and Margaret's first child, David, was born, followed 3 years later by daughter Sarah. Externally, Margaret seemed to be enjoying the perfect life of a royal princess, wife and mother. But cracks were emerging in her relationship with Tony as he struggled to leave behind his colourful past. And the royal family would suffer some of the most sensational scandals of the century. In the 1960s, Britain was undergoing a cultural reawakening. With new music, new fashions and new freedoms, the country had a spring in its step. And no one embodied this newfound energy more than Princess Margaret and her husband Tony Armstrong-Jones, now known as the Earl and Countess of Snowdon.
They were the couple that everyone wanted at their dinner party or their event. I mean, they were dazzling, both of them.
For Margaret, raised in the strict traditions of Buckingham Palace, the world of entertainers offered a chance to rebel against the expectations placed on her since childhood.
And I think Margaret found herself drawn into that world of celebrity and loving every minute of it. I think she was quite bewitched by all of that.
Now firmly established in celebrity circles, Margaret and Tony became closely associated with British comedian Peter Sellers.
Peter Sellers, of course, was slightly barking and, of course, was very, very, very funny.
Peter Sellers was an international star through the Pink Panther films. Along with his wife Britt Ekland, a future Bond girl, he was a regular visitor to Kensington Palace.
And he became quite obsessed with his new friends. I think Peter Sellers couldn't quite believe that he was going around to Princess Margaret's for dinner.
May I present, ladies and gentlemen, my impersonation in 11 seconds flat before your very eyes of Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret!
In this home video made by Peter Sellers during a weekend spent with the couple, we see Margaret taking part in one of the improvised sketches they used to write and perform together privately. Margaret's life had a glamour and a reverence never before associated with the royal family. But beneath the glittering veneer, her marriage to Tony had lost its sparkle. While she was enjoying the excitement of meeting his artistic friends, he was finding the traditions of royal life restricting.
I think Tony was getting a bit fed up of being Mr. Princess Margaret. He'd led a very free existence. And here he was, being told what to do, being told where he had to show up, at what time, and what he was expected to wear, and who he was going to meet.
Ill at ease in his new royal role, Tony threw himself into his work as one of Britain's top photographers.
He was addicted to work, really. And so I think being trapped inside palace walls was just not a life he could sustain.
Before long, his commitment was rewarded when he was appointed artistic advisor to the Sunday Times magazine.
Margaret might have been thrilled by the recognition, certainly Tony was, but the effect of that was that he had to work much harder, and it meant that she was often alone.
He was out working, and she would ring up, and at first, of course, he took the calls, and then he would refuse to take them. He felt pinned down, and the more he tried to draw away, the more she tried to become more possessive.
Margaret and Tony had very different expectations from the marriage, and their rebellious natures, which had once been a point of common ground, now became a source of conflict.
They both realised quite quickly that they had fiery tempers. They played hard, but they fought hard as well.
The root of all their problems was that they both wanted to be centre stage. Princess Margaret was used to being centre stage, and she'd never had no said to her, and she had a strong will. Tony, equally strong will, he only did what he wanted. And one of the things he wanted very much was attention.
Tony's work was not the only thing that stood between him and Margaret. In the years before their relationship began, Tony had been known for indulging in multiple non-exclusive relationships. And when he married Margaret, many of these continued.
He didn't want sex just with one woman or one princess. He wanted sex with a lot of ladies at the same time.
He was an attractive man, and he spent all his life around other attractive people, models, artists, designers, actresses, actors, and there are lots of stories of him having lots of affairs with lots of them.
During the engagement, he conceived a child by the wife of his best friend, Jeremy Fry. That child was born while he and Margaret were on honeymoon. So, no, he certainly didn't stop seeing other women.
If there was a competition to find the most promiscuous man in England, he would be up there in the first division. I'm not sure Margaret actually really knew what she was getting into in that sense.
Tony's affairs with other women soon became the worst-kept secret in royal circles. But even more scandalous for Margaret, in an age far more conservative than our own, were the rumours of his involvement with other men.
Tony Armstrong-Jones was very attractive to both sexes. I mean, there are endless rumours about the men who were attracted to him, both Jeremy Thorpe, the Liberal leader with whom he was at Eton, and Jeremy Fry.
There was a time when Princess Margaret was at a function in the United States, and her host happened to ask Princess Margaret, "How is the Queen?" And Margaret said, "Which one? My sister, my mother, or my husband?"
Not one to be slighted easily, it wasn't long before Margaret took a lead from Tony's behaviour and began affairs of her own.
Very often they were what I would describe as revenge affairs. Rather, you may not find me attractive, but look, here is somebody else who does.
She retaliated famously with the nephew of the Prime Minister Alec Douglas Hume. The most extraordinary thing about their numerous affairs with other people was that they threw these affairs in each other's faces. And on one occasion, Princess Margaret said to her husband, "Well, I slept with," and she mentioned a male friend of her husband's, and he shot back immediately, "Well, I slept with him as well."
As with Tony's affairs, rumours of Margaret's liaisons were whispered throughout royal circles. Some of the most famous names in the world became attached to her romantically.
All sorts of people have been named. There was speculation that she'd had a relationship with the British actor David Niven. Mick Jagger's even come into the frame.
Picasso allegedly offered to marry her, but she was married at the time, so he was always extravagant. Margaret liked men, she liked to be naughty. I'd be very surprised if she didn't occasionally, let go of the reins and just do what physically she wanted to do.
The rumours of Margaret's affairs soon reached Tony, and his reaction could be very public and very vicious.
Tony was much cleverer at being cruel than Margaret was, and one instance of this was that perhaps in a book that she was reading, or in the drawer where she kept her gloves, she'd find notes. One she found was 10 reasons why I hate you.
Or he would tell her at dinner to shut up, you don't know what you're talking about, let X speak, I want to hear something sensible. So he was very snubbing, and it was really awful for her.
For the Queen, if details of Margaret's life became known by the British public, the damage caused to the royal family could be irreparable.
They were supposed to set an example of how to live with Victorian values of where you put your family first and everyone behaves appropriately. And so I think the Queen was very disappointed in terms of how both Margaret and Tony were behaving. But I think, she was at the same time hoping that none of this would be made public.
The one solace Margaret had was her royal duties. With her reputation as the rebel princess firmly established by the mid-60s, it's an aspect of her life that is often overlooked.
It must have been a great thrill for the girls meeting the princess, especially so soon after her engagement.
In 1962, she took on a public role that remained dear to her throughout her life, the Chancellorship of Keele University.
It's characteristic of her to choose a university that was new and that didn't have anything sort of fusty and old-fashioned about it. With many of her other interests, she was quite fickle. With Keele University, she was incredibly consistent. I've seen testimony of graduates going back decades saying how charming, how lovely she was to them.
Margaret's sense of royal duty was put to the test when she and Tony visited America in 1965. Initially a private visit for the couple, it was soon decided, at the request of the Queen, that Margaret should also fulfil some royal duties at a time when British-American relations were strained. Prime Minister Wilson disagreed with President Lyndon Johnson over the Vietnam War, but Britain was in need of help from America to approve a vital loan of £800 million to pay off a trade deficit. It was crucial that Britain worked on the special relationship with its most powerful ally.
I think really the British government saw Margaret and Tony's trip to the US as an opportunity for members of the royal family to go in and really do the charm offensive for which they're so well known.
Margaret and Tony's tour arrived on the 4th of November 1965 with a 12-person entourage and 75 pieces of luggage.
The first thing they do is take over 2 floors of a hotel. They did conduct upwards of 60 engagements during their 3 weeks in the US, but there were a lot of problems along the way.
Sometimes a plane, when they were travelling around America, had to double back on itself to pick up the rest of the luggage. It was absurdly extravagant.
After San Francisco, the party moved to LA, where Margaret encountered the cream of Hollywood.
There were quite a lot of really, really late-night parties, and none more exciting than when she would meet some of the Hollywood stars.
But being Margaret, the meet and greets in Hollywood didn't pass without incident.
She criticised Elizabeth Taylor for the size of her ring, which she said was very vulgar. And she upset Grace Kelly by telling her she really didn't look like a movie star. And of course, Grace Kelly replied, "I wasn't born as a movie star."
But even if Margaret rubbed American celebrities the wrong way, the American public fell in love with this rebellious and glamorous royal.
The Americans have always loved our royal family, so she was the belle of the ball over there.
America just goes absolutely nuts for them. They're practically bigger than the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. You know, everywhere they go, they're completely mobbed.
After 4 days resting on a friend's ranch in Arizona, the official duties ended in Washington, where Margaret was due to meet President Lyndon Johnson at a dinner in the White House.
Both she and the president raised their glasses to each other, and the dancing, as you might expect at an event attended by Princess Margaret, went on into the wee small hours, and Margaret and the president conducted a foxtrot, a lively foxtrot.
He is absolutely swept away by her beauty and her charm, and of course, you know, she can be such great company, she can be vivacious, she's the life and soul of the party, she's gregarious, she's got stories left, right and centre, she's got dirty jokes.
Having partied with the president and wowed the American public, the trip was deemed a success by Margaret, Tony and their staff. But their reception in Britain told them a different story. The public soon discovered that the trip had cost nearly £600,000 in today's money.
Which was an outrageous sum of money. And the stories had also come out about the people that had been offended. It just didn't sit well with members of Parliament and indeed with the British public, who just viewed Margaret and Tony as having a really rather fabulous holiday at their expense.
It was quickly decided that she would never do another trip like that because she'd upset so many people. She stayed up late and got drunk at parties. She just was too much of a loose cannon.
Although the British public had been critical of Margaret's American tour, they still knew nothing of her deteriorating marriage to Tony, and neither did the Queen.
I was told very reliably that so bad were the rows between Princess Margaret and Tony that close friends thought the Queen should have some indication of the level, the volume of the acrimony. And so the Queen was invited to Kensington Palace, and Margaret and Tony were at each other's throats like it was going out of fashion.
The marriage of Margaret and Tony was in real trouble. He was spending an awful lot of time away, having affairs on the side. The problem was that, broadly amongst the public, still the royal family presented harmonious family life. So that was a problem that I think the Queen saw coming down the road.
Though still married, by 1973, Margaret and Tony were now leading increasingly separate lives. And before long, a scandal like no other would lift the lid on the truth about the rebel princess. In 1973, the public were unaware that Princess Margaret's marriage was failing. Amid rumours of her husband Tony's affairs, Margaret spent more time with friends, and a new man would enter her life.
She met Roddy Llewellyn, who was an aristocratic landscape gardener, very well respected. He was only 25 at the time. She was 17 years older. She met him at the Café Royal in Edinburgh, and they went on to this house party and had a wonderful time. And she was immediately drawn to Roddy.
By 1973, which was, I think, probably the grimmest period of her life, she was smoking too much. She was drinking too much. And what this young man does for this middle-aged lady is to give her back her sense of worth.
But as a married princess, the palace were keen that Margaret keep the affair away from the public eye.
I think the royal family took a pretty broad and sympathetic understanding. What they dreaded was anything becoming public knowledge. So as far as they were concerned, if it made Margaret happy and she could keep it quiet, that was all right. But once things become public property, then it can't be allowed to be fodder for the newspapers.
One place Princess Margaret felt she could keep the affair under wraps was at her private Caribbean home in Mustique.
Mustique was her hideaway. One of her old friends, Colin Tennant, had given her the land on which her house was built. She could have the people she wanted there in a relaxed environment with plenty of alcohol, sunny weather, and away from prying eyes. What better place to see the new man in her life and it not get into the press? But she was naive. It was always going to get into the press.
So in 1976, on Sunday morning, the Queen opens her newspaper and sees splashed all over the front page a photograph of her sister Margaret with Roddy Llewellyn. And here suddenly is her bohemian, difficult little sister exploding a bomb in front of her, because instantly it's clear to the whole world that Princess Margaret is involved in an unsuitable and adulterous love affair.
The press revelations of Margaret's affair would have a damaging impact, not only on the princess's own image, but on that of the royal family as a whole.
This was not just a regular person that had been caught out having an affair. This was Princess Margaret. She was the Queen's sister. She had a responsibility to the institution of monarchy, and people expected members of the royal family to act to a different level.
It was extraordinary. It was just all over the place. Margaret causing trouble again. I mean, the Peter Townsend stuff had been all over the papers, and there'd been a lot of sympathy for Margaret. Now there wasn't sympathy for Margaret. She had tarnished the reputation of the royal family.
The public were enraged because ministers are saying, look at Princess Margaret. She's swanning around the Caribbean with a boy 17 years her junior. She's doing it on government funds. She's just on a perpetual holiday. And so suddenly the public are crying, what about your duties, Margaret? What about your civil income list, Margaret? The Queen absolutely would have been horrified.
The public storm around the rebel princess's affair now made the marriage to Tony untenable.
The problem for the Queen is that it's clearly impossible to go on pretending that Margaret and Tony are happily married. They absolutely aren't. And this photograph clearly puts Margaret in the blame for the failure of the marriage. And there's a great deal of public sympathy for poor Tony, who is allegedly being betrayed in this way by his wife.
This I have never discussed.
Could you confirm or deny the reports that...
Could you hear that?
Yes, I could. Could you confirm or deny the reports that, in fact, you're...
That's what that's what I said. I said that in the past, and that's what...
The very idea that Princess Margaret should be the person who is causing a divorce is really hard for the royal family to take and to accept.
So clearly something needs to happen with the Snowdons' marriage. And in March, it was an announcement was made by Buckingham Palace that Tony and Margaret had formally decided to separate. Now, this announcement came out unbeknownst to Tony. He was in Australia at the time, and he issued his own statements.
I'm naturally, desperately sad in every way that this had to happen.
poor old Tony. He's being cheated on by his wife, Princess Margaret, who's swanning around the Caribbean.
Lord Snowdon, is there any hope of a reconciliation?
Thank you, Lady Celeste.
The narrative really was incredibly damaging and very difficult for the Queen to deal with.
2 years later, in 1978, Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon's divorce was finally announced.
What is the motive? I've got nothing else to say. Thank you.
The split left Margaret as the first senior royal divorcee in centuries, setting an unwanted precedent for future generations of royals.
So there we have the D word entering the royal family for the first time in 400 years, since Henry VIII. A senior member of the royal family cutting the ties of marriage and getting divorced. I think it was shocking within the royal family that this should be allowed to happen.
It was just unthinkable. There was no precedent for it, and it was seen as a failure of an ideal family.
However, what it said to people was there'd always been this image, this idea that royal marriages were always stable, happy, brilliant. This goes to prove that royal lives are just the same as ours.
This was a first, and this probably was the divorce that set the trend for future decades. Of Princess Royal getting divorced from Mark Phillips, of Charles and Diana getting divorced, and Andrew and Fergie getting divorced in 1996.
Margaret's relationship with Roddy would soon fizzle out, leaving the divorced and single princess at yet another crossroads in her life.
In 1980, Roddy had met a lady called Tanya Soskin, and this was the lady that he, the following year, married. But the princess was always very good at putting on a brave face. I think she was hurt, really.
I think that was a really hard time for her. I think it was very, very lonely. You know, she experienced intense heartbreak with Peter Townsend. She'd had heartbreak with Anthony Armstrong-Jones. She'd had heartache with Roddy Llewellyn. You know, her life was quite tear-stained in terms of her love life. And then to have this huge public battering, it was a very, very difficult time for her.
The challenge now for Princess Margaret was to rebuild her shattered public image.
She was known as a rebel princess, and the words charity work don't fit with that image, although she did do a good deal.
But trouble with younger royals was just around the corner for the rebel princess.
After Diana's Panorama interview, the princess was utterly appalled. It was a cold war between these two royal neighbours.
After the affairs, tabloid scandal and an unprecedented royal divorce in the 70s, 1981 saw Princess Margaret begin the next decade with another royal first, albeit a more positive one.
She accepted the request to do Desert Island Discs, which was unprecedented at the time. No royal figure had ever done it. I think maybe that was an attempt to sort of recast herself in terms of her public image.
I have a list here of your presidencies and patronages of various welfare organizations and children's societies, a very long list, scores of them, and they must all be visited, of course.
Yes, they must all be taken an interest in. I'm president of quite a few rather important national ones, of course, like the NSPCC. My sister was president before me, and I'm very sorry to be able to tell you that it's got very much worse, the cruelty to children.
Yes.
I don't think the princess was known for making an awful lot of speeches, but when she cared about a subject particularly, and she really did care about children and the NSPCC particularly, she could make a most eloquent and impassioned speech.
We know that some children can die of neglect. Thousands more can be stunted physically and emotionally throughout their lives through lack of love or want of proper care and nurturing. These are the forgotten children whom we must never let the world forget.
She was always known as a sort of rebel princess, and the words charity work don't fit with that image. And so I think her charity work tended rather to be overlooked, although she did do a good deal.
She may have had the image of a royal rebel, but the princess was patron of over 80 charities. And it was her work with one cause in particular in which she set yet another lesser-known precedent.
Everyone associates Diana with AIDS, but actually Margaret was there first, but probably didn't get the publicity for it.
In 1987, she became involved with London Lighthouse and the AIDS victims. Before Diana became very involved, she was never a touchy-feely person, but she was there making the people there laugh, being supportive and sympathetic. And 1988, she opened their new place.
By the 1990s, Diana was the most famous princess in the world, a position once occupied by Margaret herself. But as the elder princess began to fade from the public eye, she would take issue with the new princesses on the royal scene.
I think when Diana came on the scene and Fergie were the focus of all the press attention around the UK, she was playing jealous. No, she had been the belle of the ball. She had been the one that people wanted to follow. So I think she was jealous and she was unsympathetic towards their behaviour. I know that after Diana's Panorama interview, when she divulged everything about her marriage to Martin Bashir, Margaret was utterly appalled.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
As far as Margaret was concerned, that was the ultimate act of betrayal. Yes, Margaret had had her own infidelities, but you don't talk about them on a public forum, you don't air your dirty laundry, and more than that, you don't throw the entire royal family and with it the institution of monarchy under the bus. She was furious.
Margaret's fury also extended to Sarah Ferguson, after details of the Duchess's affair were leaked to the press.
These are the pictures that the Queen and her son, the Duke of York, will have seen at the breakfast table at Balmoral this morning. An intimate series of photos showing her daughter-in-law and his wife, topless at the poolside in the south of France, kissing a Texan millionaire.
The Mail on Sunday reported a letter Margaret wrote to her saying, "Clearly you have never considered the damage you are causing us all. How dare you discredit us like this?"
There is a great irony with how Princess Margaret reacts to Diana and Sarah Ferguson. They, of course, go through quite a torrid time in their relationships. They have a huge amount of press intrusion, and you would think that Margaret, having gone through all of this, might have been, slightly kindly and a wee bit benevolent to these women, but she's quite harsh towards them.
Margaret's rebellion toward Diana and Fergie would not fail to escape the attention of her sister.
The Queen did try to intervene, I've been told, but I think experience would have told Queen Elizabeth that not much can be done. This is my sister, she's always been an issue, she's always been difficult, we're just going to have to accept that.
From now on, the headlines Margaret made were increasingly due to her ill health.
Princess Margaret arrived at the exclusive London hospital just after 8 this morning. She walked unaided from the car, although she looked a little tired and unsteady.
She had her first stroke in 1998. A year later, she had a dreadful accident where she scalded her feet. She was in a terrible way after that. In 2000 and 2001, she had strokes again, and she wasn't really able to conduct official engagements in the way that she used to. The strokes started to affect her speech, left her very depressed.
I remember sitting next to her on a number of occasions at lunch at Windsor Castle, and she did cut a very sad figure, because looking back on the sort of 1950s and the 1960s, this very beautiful woman, frequently photographed, very happy-go-lucky, and now seeing her confined to a wheelchair with wraparound glasses, finding it very difficult to hold a conversation. You couldn't help but feel sorry for her, and I did.
After suffering a final stroke, Princess Margaret died on February the 9th, 2002, aged 71.
Draped in her own blue and crimson standard, Princess Margaret's coffin leaves the King Edward VII Hospital late this afternoon.
Her death was a devastating blow to the Queen in the year of her Golden Jubilee.
I was there in Windsor for Princess Margaret's funeral, and the Queen, she doesn't often show emotion, but in that moment she couldn't hold back the tears. And I'm sure the Queen in that moment felt very alone, because it had been the two of them through their childhood, and she'd always been so protective of her troubled little sister.
Troubled, scandalous, but complex. Princess Margaret began life as the spare to the heir, only to discard that ill-defined role and instead become the rebel without a crown.
She wasn't going to be this dutiful younger sister to the Queen. She decided very early on that she didn't want to do that. She broke the rules. She lived quite a reckless life for a royal.
I mean, she was fantastically grand, fantastically snobbish, and she did tarnish the reputation of the royal family by her lifestyle, by her broken marriages, by bringing divorce into the fold. But that too has another side to it, because she cleared the way for younger members of the royal family to get out of unhappy marriages.
She led an extraordinary life for a royal, in a way that, you know, the Queen has led a very even-paced life where very little has changed. She's done her duty. That's been her watchword. Margaret, on the other hand, kicked over the traces, was extravagant.
She was a bit naughty and she was a bit of a rebel. But, you know, you want to ask yourself, who would you like to be sat next to at dinner? Princess Margaret or a bit of a bore? I know which I prefer.
sầu lo nhiều lúc ước mơ rằng được phép nhiệm màu đưa tôi về thuở xa xưa, bay cao của cánh diều đôi chân vây đàn bạn hồn như ngày thơ vui đôi ngày tháng để lòng tôi hân hoan dưới bề mây ngày xưa dấu yêu còn đâu. Ngày xưa tôi thả những cành diều dây lướt trên bầu trời phiêu